They called it the Nightmare. Not because it was the deadliest weapon the Soviets ever built, but because NATO pilots never truly knew when it would strike. The missile didn't roar like a jet or flash like tracer fire. It whispered through the radar spectrum, unseen until the cockpit warning light screamed red. 1 second, a pilot was cruising above enemy terrain. The next, his headphones filled with static and a needle-thin line appeared on the scope. Somewhere below, a Soviet SA-2 Guideline had locked on. There was no visual, no heat signature, and often no time. The paradox was simple but terrifying. The surface-to-air missile, SAM, was meant to bring balance to the sky, to give ground forces the power to challenge air supremacy. Yet for NATO aviators trained to dominate from above, it flipped the very nature of warfare. From the late 1950s onward, dogfighting and bombing were no longer just contests of speed or skill. They became battles against invisible mathematics, radar equations, frequencies, and jamming codes. A pilot's fate might depend less on his reflexes than on the precision of a transistor deep inside a Soviet radar van. The roots of that nightmare began in the early Cold War, when the Soviet Union faced a dire strategic problem. American bombers, flying high above 40,000 feet, could penetrate Soviet airspace almost at will. The B-47 and later the B-52, carrying nuclear payloads, rendered traditional anti-aircraft guns obsolete. Stalin's engineers had already tried heavier cannons, like the massive 130mm KS-30, but even these couldn't reach the altitude of jet bombers. The answer had to be something radically new. A weapon that could think faster than the gunner's eye and reach higher than any shell. In 1953, scientists at the Lavochkin Design Bureau began work on the S-75 system, later known to NATO as the SA-2 Guideline. Its concept was brutally efficient. Use radar guidance to track the target and steer a supersonic missile into its path. Unlike the reactive defenses of the past, this weapon created a dome of denial. Once the radar locked on, the missile could climb to 60,000 feet, accelerating past Mach 3. The explosive warhead, packed with 200 kilograms of high explosive, didn't even need a direct hit. Its proximity fuse would detonate when near enough to shred an aircraft with shrapnel. By the late 1950s, the first operational sites ringed Moscow. In 1960, the world witnessed what these missiles could do. A U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down at 70,000 feet over Sverdlovsk, an altitude once thought untouchable. The event shook Washington and thrilled Soviet engineers. Khrushchev boasted that the missile had pierced the arrogance of American invulnerability. For the first time in aviation history, a man had been brought down from the stratosphere not by a fighter, but by a radar pulse and a missile born from mathematics. But for NATO, this was only the beginning. As surface-to-air missiles spread across Warsaw Pact and client states, the balance of power in the air changed. During the Vietnam War, Soviet advisors trained North Vietnamese crews to use the S-75 against American aircraft. The first successful strike came in July 1965 when an F-4C Phantom was torn apart near Hanoi. U.S. pilots soon learned to fear the sudden streak of white smoke rising from the jungle, the telltale signature of a Guideline launch. It wasn't just a missile, it was a psychological weapon. Pilots began to refer to the skies over North Vietnam as Sam Alley. Each engagement became a chess game between radar operators and pilots, both sides improvising tactics in real time. American forces developed countermeasures, chaff dispensers, electronic jammers, and the now iconic Wild Weasel missions, where specialized aircraft hunted the SAM sites themselves. Still, the missiles kept coming. Between 1965 and 1972, more than 9,000 SA-2s were fired in Vietnam, downing hundreds of aircraft. For pilots, the nightmare wasn't just dying, it was dying without ever seeing the enemy. What made the SAM truly terrifying was its precision layered with uncertainty. Pilots could never be sure if a radar lock was real or just electronic interference. The missile might explode miles away, or it might tear through their fuselage before they even knew it was coming. The sound of the RWR, the radar warning receiver, became the most dreaded tone in the cockpit. NATO aircrews trained obsessively in electronic warfare schools, learning to read the radar threat libraries like a second language. Each codename, Fansong, Flatface, Spoonrest, represented a potential killer on the other end of the signal. And yet, despite all the fear, the missile's power also revealed its limitations. The SAM could create zones of denial, but it couldn't win air superiority. It was a shield, not a sword. For NATO, the challenge became not just surviving it, but defeating it, outsmarting it, turning the nightmare back on its creator. And that race, to outthink the missile, was only just beginning. Every radar pulse has an echo, and by the late 1960s, NATO was learning how to speak back. The nightmare that began with the SA-2 Guideline had forced a transformation inside Western air forces. The old confidence that speed and altitude alone could protect bombers was gone. Pilots who once trained for dogfights now studied radar frequencies and jamming protocols. Victory no longer meant shooting down the enemy. It meant surviving long enough to drop ordnance and return home. To fight the missile, NATO had to become part engineer, part magician. The first countermeasure was simple: deception. When the missile's radar beam illuminated an aircraft, the pilot could release thin strips of aluminum foil, chaff, that created a cloud of false reflections. The early chaff bundles, codenamed Window, had been used since World War II, but now they evolved into precision-engineered countermeasures, cut to specific wavelengths to confuse Soviet radar. Each burst filled the sky with thousands of phantom aircraft. For a moment, the radar operators below would lose their lock, and that single heartbeat of confusion could save a crew. But the Soviets adapted quickly. Their radars began switching frequencies faster, learning to distinguish real aircraft from decoys. So NATO engineers took the fight deeper into the electromagnetic spectrum. They developed ECM pods, electronic countermeasure units mounted under the wings of strike aircraft. Inside each was a symphony of signals, noise generators, false targets, and active jammers that could blind or deceive the Fansong radar guiding the SA-2. What had once been a simple air raid now resembled a duel of invisible codes. The Americans fielded specialized aircraft, the F-105F Wild Weasel and later the F-4G, designed not to evade the missile, but to hunt it. Crews flew into the teeth of radar coverage, baiting the enemy to activate their tracking systems. Once the radar came alive, the Wild Weasel could lock onto its emissions and fire back with AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles. "You gotta be crazy to do this job," one pilot said in 1967, "but you only have to be crazy once." Meanwhile, Soviet engineers weren't idle. They refined the SAM doctrine into layers of defense. Newer systems like the SA-3 GOA were introduced for low-altitude coverage, while mobile launchers allowed rapid redeployment after each strike. The SAM belt around Hanoi became one of the densest air defense networks on Earth, a grid of radar-guided fire that forced NATO aircraft to fly lower and faster, where anti-aircraft guns and small arms waited. The nightmare had multiplied, missiles above, guns below. The human toll was staggering. By 1968, losses of F-105s had reached levels that forced tactical rethinking. The sleek jet, once celebrated as a supersonic bomber, became a frequent casualty list entry. U.S. Air Force analysts began dissecting wreckage, discovering that even near misses from the SA-2's proximity warhead could shatter wings or ignite fuel lines. Pilots started flying with SAM sense, an instinct honed by trauma. diving at the first radar lock, counting seconds between launch and detonation. Ironically, the very terror of the missile produced innovation that would define future warfare. NATO engineers miniaturized electronics, creating warning receivers that could identify threat types by their radar signature. Fighter cockpits sprouted new displays, turning invisible radar waves into blinking symbols that pilots could interpret in seconds. Out of necessity came the birth of electronic warfare as a discipline, an invisible front where victory meant silence on the scope. And as the SAM threat evolved, so did aircraft weapons. The M60 machine gun, mounted in helicopter door gunner positions, became a crucial defense for low-flying rescue and reconnaissance missions in Vietnam. Crews flying through Sam Alley relied on suppressive fire to protect downed pilots and jam sites. These smaller guns, descendants of the WW-02 MG-42, symbolized the shift in doctrine. Wars would no longer be won by altitude and mass, but by precision and adaptability. Even the rise of later weapons like the M240 traced back to this era's brutal lessons in survivability and fire discipline. By the early 1970s, the U.S. Air Force had adapted its tactics enough to regain limited freedom of action. Newer jammers, faster aircraft, and better intelligence coordination reduced losses, though never to zero. The nightmare had been contained, but never fully defeated. Every mission over a defended zone still carried that electric tension. Somewhere out there, a radar dish might be turning, and a missile battery might be waiting. For the Soviets, the success of the SAM network became both a triumph and a trap. It reinforced their belief that air defense supremacy could replace air superiority. Massive investment flowed into radar complexes and missile regiments, while fighter development lagged behind. On paper, this made sense. Didn't tire, didn't disobey orders, and could be hidden under camouflage nets. But war would soon reveal a cruel irony. Technology that once frightened the enemy could also blind its creators. Because as NATO adapted to the SAM, it began turning the system's own logic against it. By the 1980s, radar deception and stealth technology were no longer theories, they were operational weapons. The stage was set for a new kind of confrontation, a duel between invisibility and detection. And when the next generation of aircraft entered the skies, the Soviet missile crews discovered that their nightmare had changed shape. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union's air defense grid had become one of the most extensive military systems ever constructed by man. From East Germany to the Pacific coast, radar domes and missile batteries dotted the map like an electronic fortress. Each S-75, S-125, and S-200 site linked to an integrated command network capable, at least in theory, of detecting and destroying intruders long before they reached key targets. Soviet doctrine called it PVO Strany, the air defense of the homeland, a force so vast it rivaled the entire Soviet Air Force in manpower and budget. For Moscow, this wasn't just a military necessity, it was psychological redemption. The humiliations of World War II, when German bombers had struck Moscow and Leningrad, had left deep scars. The missile network was a promise that such vulnerability would never return. Each launch site stood as both shield and monument, a testament to technological sovereignty. But beneath the confidence lay a quiet anxiety. The system that promised perfect protection also demanded perfection to function, and in war, perfection rarely survives contact with reality. When Soviet-designed missiles began appearing outside the Warsaw Pact, they carried the aura of invincibility. Egypt deployed them during the War of Attrition in 1969, where they proved devastating against Israeli aircraft. Within a single week, a dozen Israeli jets were lost to SA-2 and SA-3 systems. The lesson was unmistakable. For the first time, Western-trained pilots were being shot down by Soviet radar. It was a wake-up call that sent NATO tacticians scrambling to study every captured fragment and frequency report. But in the Middle East, the system also revealed its cracks. The missile sites had to remain fixed to operate efficiently, and once Israeli reconnaissance identified their positions, the counterstrikes came swiftly. During the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Egypt's early SAM success was blunted as Israeli aircraft adapted, flying low, deploying electronic jammers, and using anti-radiation missiles much like the U.S. Wild Weasels in Vietnam. The umbrella that once protected Egyptian forces began to thin. Soviet advisors were stunned. Their weapons worked perfectly in simulations, but war had a way of corrupting even the best equations. Inside Soviet research centers, engineers debated how to close the gap. The answer came in the form of the S-300 project, an advanced, multi-missile platform that could track multiple targets, move quickly, and resist jamming. Developed by Almaz in the late 1970s, it aimed to erase every weakness the West had exploited. Its phased array radar was a marvel of electronics, able to switch frequencies almost instantly, while the missile's solid-fuel engine allowed for fast launches against high-speed threats. When Western intelligence first learned of the system, NATO analysts called it the most dangerous surface-to-air weapon ever built. But progress came at a price. The complexity of the new systems demanded elite crews, constant maintenance, and centralized coordination. Training shortfalls meant that outside the Soviet Union, export clients often used older models like the S-75 or S-125, systems already vulnerable to NATO's maturing countermeasures. The dream of a seamless missile shield was colliding with economic reality. In Afghanistan, the contradiction became painful. The Soviet Army entered the conflict in 1979 with overwhelming firepower, including SAM units meant to protect convoys and airfields. Yet the enemy, guerrilla fighters armed with American Stinger missiles, flipped the equation. Now it was Soviet pilots who feared the invisible enemy in the sky. The once feared SAM doctrine had no answer to the mobility and simplicity of man-portable air defense systems. Entire convoys had to move under cover of night, and even heavily armed Mi-24 Hind gunships, symbols of Soviet air might, found themselves hunted. For the first time, Moscow's generals realized that technological dominance could not guarantee psychological control. The missile network had made them powerful but cautious. NATO, by contrast, was becoming agile. Exercises like Red Flag in Nevada trained pilots to survive radar-saturated environments, teaching them to treat every flight as a live-fire engagement. Out of this discipline came the stealth doctrine, machines designed not to jam or dodge radar, but to erase themselves from it. By the time the 1980s arrived, Western engineers had turned that theory into hardware. The F-107 Nighthawk was invisible not by speed or altitude, but by geometry and coating. Its surfaces reflected radar waves away rather than back. Against conventional radar systems, it appeared smaller than a bird. Soviet analysts who first detected its radar signature during test flights over Europe were incredulous. It didn't match any known aircraft type. To them, it seemed like an error, a glitch in the network. This was the new paradox. The empire of missiles had forced NATO to become invisible. In trying to dominate the sky through electronics, the Soviets had created the very threat that would render their own sensors blind. For NATO pilots, who had once called the SAM their nightmare, the tables were turning. They were learning to walk through the nightmare's shadow unseen. And when that invisible shadow finally entered combat, the myth of the perfect missile would meet its reckoning. The first test of invisibility came not over Moscow or Berlin, but over Baghdad. In the early hours of January 17, 1991, the night sky above Iraq was streaked with tracer fire and the flashes of missile launches. The Iraqi military, equipped with Soviet-built SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 systems, had prepared for years to repel an air assault. Their radar operators watched their screens light up with targets. Then, just as quickly, the blips began to vanish. Something was in the air, but it wasn't visible in any conventional sense. The F-117 Nighthawk had arrived. When the first bombs struck command centers and radar installations, they came from aircraft that the Iraqis couldn't track, much less intercept. The Soviet-designed radar arrays that had once been feared across the world were suddenly deaf. Every signal returned silence. Every lock attempt failed. By dawn, entire sections of Iraq's air defense network were paralyzed. The nightmare that NATO pilots had lived with for decades now belonged to someone else. It wasn't that the Soviet missiles had become useless. Their mechanical and explosive power remained formidable. But warfare had moved beyond what they were built to fight. The SA-2 Guideline, the same system that had once downed Gary Powers' U-2 and hundreds of aircraft over Vietnam, was now an aging relic. It relied on radar reflections from metallic surfaces, predictable flight paths, and radar frequencies that stealth aircraft had been designed to absorb or scatter. The once mighty shield of the people had become a blindfold. And yet, the story wasn't as simple as technology conquering technology. In the ruins of radar vans and command bunkers, analysts found traces of human limitation. Rigid hierarchies, slow communication, and a faith in centralized control that had suffocated initiative. Soviet doctrine had always emphasized coordination from above, but stealth warfare demanded chaos from below. Independent operators making rapid, adaptive choices. The West had learned flexibility through fear. The East, discipline through doctrine. In 1991, those philosophies met, and the sky went silent. Still, the legacy of the SAM did not end in defeat. It forced a generation of NATO pilots to think differently, to fight against unseen threats with both courage and calculation. The wild Weasels who once flew into radar traps laid the foundation for electronic warfare squadrons that still operate today. Every modern fighter jet, from the F-15E to the F-35, carries DNA born from that struggle. Radar warning receivers, ECM pods, and mission software that trace their lineage to the desperate battles over Hanoi and the dense missile fields of the Cold War. Even the smallest details, the gun mounts, the defensive reflexes, the coordination between air crews and ground observers were shaped by the SAM era. Door gunners with M60 machine guns and M240s in low-flying rescue helicopters learned to watch the sky not just for aircraft, but for missile plumes. Ground convoys hardened their doctrine around layered defense, a concept later used in gun truck convoys in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later. In a way, every forgotten weapon of that era contributed a line to the same story, the eternal arms race between detection and deception. For the Soviet Union, the legacy was more complicated. The missile shield had consumed enormous resources and engineering talent, producing marvels like the S-300 and eventually the S-400, systems that still command global respect. Yet the empire that built them collapsed before it could test their full potential. The Cold War had proven that technological dominance without adaptability is brittle. When history shifted, the system that once guaranteed survival became a monument to what could no longer change fast enough. In the decades that followed, the nightmare evolved but never disappeared. The same principles, radar guidance, heat-seeking, electronic warfare, continue to define modern conflict zones. In Ukraine, Syria, and the South China Sea, surface-to-air missiles remain both sword and shield, their radar eyes searching for targets in skies filled with drones, stealth fighters, and decoys. The tools have changed, but the feeling in a pilot's chest when the radar warning tone sounds, that cold rush of fear, is timeless. If the story of the NATO pilot's nightmare has any lasting lesson, it's this. Every weapon born from fear eventually creates fear in return. The SAM taught aviators humility, engineers creativity, and strategists caution. It showed that no invention, however perfect, exists outside the human instinct to adapt. The missile's invisible arc from ground to sky mirrored the same paradox that drives all warfare, the race to see without being seen, to control chaos without being consumed by it. When NATO pilots today fly into contested airspace, they carry the ghosts of those first radar locks in Vietnam and the coded warnings that once echoed through their headphones. They know that somewhere, on a silent screen, another operator is waiting, watching, calculating. The nightmare isn't gone. It has simply changed sides, changed form, changed frequency. And as long as human beings wage war through machines that see farther than we do, the sky will never be quiet.